Welcome back to another edition of AGI Schools Out Saturdays, where we're preparing kids for their future, not our past. I'm super excited today. I have a new friend that I met at an AI symposium here in Indiana recently, Lena Darnay. She is Director of Communications at the CIESC. Lena, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you guys are doing there.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to come and join you for this conversation today. It was such a treat to run into you, and just it felt like meeting an old friend that I hadn't met before when we were standing in the coffee line. And I am thrilled to be here to share a little bit about not only what we're doing here at CIESC, but kind of some observations that we've been making as we work around the state and even nationally. So, Central Indiana Educational Service Center is one of 9 educational service centers here in the state of Indiana. We are all independent nonprofits. CIESC, the one I work at, is, of course, probably the largest by far because we serve the metropolitan area of Indiana, right around the capital city. And, of course, those suburban and rural areas that feed into the metropolitan area. So we have about 22 no, we have 35 member school districts. 220,000 students are served by our region alone, which is 1 in 5 students in Indiana. So we really make an impact in the pre-K to 12 space. And it's something that we're really proud of because as a service agency, we work behind the scenes. I don't know how much, do you know much about the service center model across the country?
No, I do not. I was involved with the sales certification conversation. I think that's really how I met you all. Ryan Murray invited me to that conversation, and it's been nothing but an amazing journey so far. I've had a whole lot of your employees on the podcast. I know you all are doing amazing work, but I don't know really what the national model looks like.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I was a school librarian at a metropolitan high school that was a member school district. It is a member school district here of CIESC. And so I attended trainings and conferences and worked with them on cooperative purchasing in terms of library supplies and knew that they were kind of in the background, but didn't really understand just how essential the service centers are to school districts until I started working for CIESC in October of 2020. I came over during the pandemic. I was the instructional technology specialist for a large metropolitan school district, really getting all that training for our educators pre-pandemic to move into Canvas and using online supports for their classrooms. Then it got really popular in 2020 when everything that I had said for the last 3 years was now needed. So it had context. And then I came over and started doing that for Keep Indiana Learning, which you may be familiar with. And that is part of our parent organization. They're our professional development arm, but they're one of probably 7 different major departments at CIESC that serve schools that I don't think people really know. We stand in the background, but we're not an extension of a school, but we extend services to schools. And because we're a nonprofit, every dollar that school districts or parents who use us for driver education or schools and families that use us for Indiana Online Summer School, those dollars are reinvested back into programs like SAIL, where we create convenings and panels and opportunities for schools to come in at a very low cost to them, but a high quality staff member is paid for through these other programs. So there's this really interesting entrepreneurial nonprofit going on behind the scenes of schools, not just in Indiana, but really almost every state has some type of framework of an educational service agency. And it's just fascinating to think about how we are coming together with community organizations and other advocates out there to build this matrix of support, like a network that just allows schools to have the best of what they need provided to them in an easy to access, high quality way.
That's interesting. It almost reminds me. So I worked in the behavioral health space before I got completely into the AI space, and it almost reminds me of the Purdue Extension and the way that they are in different communities around Indiana, trying to help the community organizations of those different communities leverage the resources that Purdue has. Is that somewhat similar, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good parallel to pull in. A lot of our systems of support work so well in the back end and really maintain this kind of in the wings type persona. We're just here to help. You all do the big stuff out front with the consumers, with the people that you're engaging with the students, with those who need your support. And we're just back here to help when you need us. And for me as a librarian, that's kind of been my jam since I got into this field is I just want to be back here to provide you with whatever it is that you need in the moment to do the work you're doing in the forefront, because that's what's so important. And we know as those of us in the field, we can't do it without our support system. And so being part now of the support system is really fun.
Yeah, someday I may have to introduce you to Dr. Nicole Adams from the Purdue School of Nursing. She has done some. When we were first trying to develop recovery systems of care, which is kind of an East Coast model for integrated systems of care around substance use and mental health issues, that has been very effective at creating warm handoffs and bringing down silos. And we were leveraging at the community level strategic doing and another very similar product, but Dr. Adams led a lot of those conversations in the community. So it wasn't a matter of Purdue telling the community how to do it. It was a matter of them convening the stakeholders and then giving them the methodology to best work together. And it even brought her to that work with Native Americans in North and South Dakota and some of their tribes. It's some pretty amazing. I really respect that model.
I love it. And it does feel really rewarding too for those of us who know that the essential way that we serve is unique to the role that we have. So there's no other entity really in the state of Indiana that has the school districts in forefront while we go into all these conversations with workforce development or higher ed institutions or state agencies. Like we're the ones that'll be there advocating for schools in a very specific way. Like there are lots of chambers that are advocating for industry, but there's only the service centers that are really advocating for schools in those conversations in this meaningful support way. And so for me, I take that onus of responsibility really to heart. And now as the director of communications for this large educational service center, like that's what I do. I just want people to know what we do, how we do it, and how we can help.
Well, and I would love for you to get into the sale. I do want to advocate. This is not advocating for myself. What I love is that they included in the conversation a guy who has a podcast who's talked to for 2 years educators and who has tried to implement artificial intelligence as a no code person in small to medium sized business, but is not directly related to the education. So just expanding that network out of stakeholders that they brought into the conversation. And again, I'm not saying bring me into the, but find somebody who maybe has a lens that's slightly different. I love that model. And so tell us a little bit about Sale and where you all are at with that.
Yeah, SAIL is the AI leadership team that they are working to create really that network of support for community organizations specific to the educational landscape. So, those that touch within the educational space, which is why I think you were invited in because we need loud voices. And by golly, Jason, you got one.
All that covered.
And we like brand ambassadors, those who will go out and say good things about us in rooms of possibility. So again, I think we've got you hooked in there. But what the goal was to think about, we're all former educators. 99% of us are former Indiana educators. Like we've been in those classrooms, we've been working with those students, we've been advocating for those communities for our whole career. And when we saw this innovation coming really fast, rolling down the hill at schools and thought, gosh, they're going to need help. And so instead of just trying to put help that we think schools need or leaders need or educators need into their space, we said, let's talk to them first. Let's elevate the teacher voice. That's a huge piece for us at Keep Indiana Learning, is to elevate practitioner experience. Nobody knows it like you know it. And so bringing and convening those groups together so that we can solve problems out loud. When you're trying to solve them in a vacuum, you think you might have the information you need, but if you've never heard from someone just down the road from you what they're thinking about, you can't couple together to emphasize bigger components and solve problems together. So that was really it. Is a service center is a great convener. We're the intermediary that helps just bring those voices together. So sales started from conversations authentically with educators, leaders, community advocates, and then we just started building it out. Sometimes the biggest piece is who's going to do the work to start moving the progress down the line. We are also that that pivot point for a lot of those projects. So service centers can have staff that have time to investigate. They have time to research and they have time to put things together on paper where the teachers, the leaders, they're out doing the hard job in the front lines. We can be in the background doing that. So I think SAIL also really benefits from our team who I know you've talked to on the podcast, Ryan Murray and Tanika Canardle and maybe Jenna Cooper as well. She's leading it as our director of technology and innovation. They do hard work every day, putting things together so that we can build upon that when we go out into the field and help support the schools. And that's really the heart of what we do.
Yeah, and I've seen that firsthand through some of the symposiums that have been recently held. And I do want to say, like the K through 12 space is nearest and dearest to my heart. I have done some volunteer educating in both the retirement community and with younger people. My wife was a teacher when I met her, an English teacher at a charter high school for kids with drug and alcohol problems, and I volunteered there at times. But like I have three kids, and that's really where my I we live in Carmel, and it's not cheap to live in Carmel. And we've both been in social work most of our lives, and we lived here because we wanted our kids to have a better life than we do and have the best educational opportunities. And we felt like Carmel was one of the best school systems. And our oldest daughter, who's visiting with our new granddaughter right now, got her PharmD from Purdue and is doing amazing. Our son got his biochem undergrad from Purdue and is doing amazing. Our daughter is going to be a sophomore at Carmel, and Carmel has been teaching their teachers about AI for 2.5 years and haven't put it in the classroom yet. And I will not stop until they do, saying that I disagree with that. Like I think that the post-secondary education model is so driven by finance that they're going to have to make whatever pivots they have to make to prepare kids for paying jobs, or else people won't pay them to give them an education. All right, but K through 12 is a little different. They don't have the same economic weights on them, and so I really think that the work you guys are doing is so important because K through 12 education is going to prepare kids for a future that I think is going to be very different. In the next five, my wife has been saying, I don't really see the AI stuff. Now it's starting to bubble up into the public, right? I'm just kind of a funny side note. When I first dove into AI, I showed her YouTube, 90-minute YouTube from Jeffrey Hinton talking about what possibly was to come. And she was so freaked out by it that she was like, okay, do whatever you need to do. I don't want to hear a lot about it, but do whatever you need to do to prepare us for this future. And now, while I do think Hinton like overblows that stuff so he can make money, I like some of that stuff is starting to become a reality. And I do think that it's going to disrupt our workforce and change things a lot in the next 5 to 10 years.
It's funny you say that, Jason. In 1994, I was a sophomore in high school and I went to a youth leadership summit. And we were sitting in the planetarium of Denver University, and they had a panel about the future. And they introduced the concept of the information superhighway and the World Wide Web. And they thought that was probably going to impact our college and maybe a little bit of what we did for a career. They didn't know that we were on the precipice of the internet revolution, and it would totally change the trajectory of my career. The way that I engage with information is so different now than I did in high school that I can't even imagine what that same panel would say about AI just 30 years later. Like the fact that they have gone so widely spread out with this idea of information being at our fingertips at the ready through the internet. What would they say now if they could see what AI has become just 30 years later?
And that's the real choke point, isn't it? The fact that things are advancing more and more rapidly all the time. I mean, Bill Gates was on with Oprah Winfrey a couple of years ago and said that he thought that AI would be bigger than the internet and cause even more changes. And for a guy like Bill Gates to say that, like you have to take that somewhat seriously. He's not trying to raise money like Sam Altman or Dario Amodei, right? He's got his money in his foundation, and he's still sitting back and going, "Wow, this is going to be a game changer for all of us."
And imagine our students now. So my son's a sophomore going into his junior year in high school, and I'm trying to imagine what he would feel like in just 2 years when he goes into college with AI being so prevalent. And if we don't start thinking about changing the frameworks of what we're asking students to do, how we're asking them to engage with this technology, what we are putting in terms of guardrails, but also open road. We cannot just block this thing until they can't do anything at all with it, because imagine the future that they could create if they knew what was happening in the back end, they saw the future in the front end, and were able to make their own pathway forward and through, because they'll be leading us very soon. That generation that are native to AI will be leading us as a country and as a civilization.
Well, and I did see at the, AI symposium that you all put on, the Richmond kids talk, and I was like, "That is the future." I've always loved the Zen saying, "In a beginner's mind, the possibilities are limitless, and in an expert mind, they're finite." I think this is the time for adults in the education system to provide that wisdom and judgment and safety, and kids to almost lead with that like, I work for an AI company, and I will tell you, there are things that I get LLMs to do that surprise the software engineers that live in San Francisco because they think about it from what it used to be able to do. And I'm like dumbly walking in going, I wonder if it could do this and give it 2 weeks and it can. Right. And so it's amazing.
Well, and I love too thinking about how you mentioned workforce, how workforce is and is not prepared for the students who will become their entry level partners. And I really think that entry level is going to shift in language. We have to start thinking about them as prepared to do skills that we haven't identified as important yet in industry. And so they're not really entry level as much as they are changing the way that our transition to work has to look if we're going to have successful cohesion between what students coming into the workforce expect out of a culture, a climate, a skill base, and what the industry employers are going to expect from them in terms of work ethic, productivity, those types of skills, soft skills that they talk about. There might be a big mismatch between definitions if we're not careful.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I've actually even expanded my thoughts on this. So I've had several computer science students that from Purdue on the podcast, and I'm always telling them and the data science students like, you guys think that you can't get a job because you're thinking too like I want to go work for Meta on a big data team, or I want to go work for Amazon on a big software engineering team. And yes, though they are using Claude to make their shareholders think that they can get rid of half their workforce. Uh, but think about all the small to medium sized businesses that are looking at this AI thing and going, how in the world do we safely deploy this in our business? And now I used to think if you had a computer science or data science background, you were gold to them. I also think that there is a new form of no code people who are just good at working with large language models. And if they understand kind of the meta orchestration in the background, they can be extremely valuable too. So maybe you did get a marketing degree, but you understand how to leverage large language models. Now you can come in and show that marketing agency how to become a 2030 agency instead of get left behind by these startups that are not hiring anybody, that are just leveraging the technology to do it all.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, the vibe coding that our team has been doing and showing us how they can basically give these very narrative prompts and very clearly written but not technical prompt language to the AI bots. And then they just make these beautiful, functional elements that we can put right into play. That's what we did with our Keep Indiana Learning conference, the KennelCon that just happened earlier this week. Ryan Murray on our team, who is the leader of the SAIL work, he vibe coded this conference app that was instantly changeable just as soon as we realized how powerful it was to be able to code with language versus coding with like true code. We could do what we've always wanted our conference app to do that we never had the customization power to do before. And it was all in our hands. And the cost was so much less for us to do it through this program that he used, Replit, and then trying to pay for Cvent or one of the big conference app providers that was very much like plug and play. This is what you get, this is what it can do, and you don't get any alternatives. And I just think, gosh, that's this year. the changes that'll come between this year and next year, I can't even imagine what it's gonna look like.
It's amazing, and it does speak to the fact I love that we can customize software. I do it inside my company for us as well. Uh, if you're working for Eli Lilly or a healthcare organization or a legal you're still gonna need the software engineer mindset to scale those things and make them safe at, like, a 10,000 person company level, and so, there's a place for everybody, and it just kinda creates this ecosystem where I think that a really strong skill set coming straight out of college is if you know a little bit about project management and you know a little bit about design and you understand technical writing, not necessarily code, but like just somewhat how the machine thinks, then you are extremely valuable.
That's the skill set right there, and it's interesting because, Ryan and I did the tie-in, the Teacher Industry Experiences in Indiana program for a couple of years in a row, where we had teachers go with us to do behind-the-scenes tours of Indiana businesses, large and small, and almost 100% of the time, we'd get a panel of industry professionals together, and it didn't matter if we were in big pharma or small town Main Street America talking about, small chambers of commerce. Every time they would answer the question, "What technology do your incoming employees need to have?" They'd say spreadsheets. It was either Excel or Sheets, but a spreadsheet to understand how to organize data thoughtfully and then manipulate it in a spreadsheet was the number one thing they wanted. And imagine someone coming in that understands how information is stored, accessed, retrieved, sorted, organized, and they have the power of the AI tools for a lot of the interpretation and the culling of the data and combing through it. That together is the magical sauce that they were all looking for.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Evals, like how to evaluate
Oh,
systems,
so big.
agentic workflows like LLM routers, that's my next exploration, right? So you can't just deploy Claude and 10,000 agents in a company at $10 per million input tokens and $50 per million output tokens. Like it'll cost you more than having humans do it. But if you understand how to route like the low level work
Yeah.
to an on-prem Chemi model that costs you nothing to run, and you save the Claude for like strategic decisions, like doing all that kind of work. That's all fascinating. I do think two of the things that well, three things I'd love to run by you. I love the fact, and I'm actually really jealous. So I'm 52 years old. When I and I never finished college because I ended up in long term recovery. We'll just leave it at that. But when I went into college, I had 2 choices that I either wanted to get a PhD in psychology and go to work for the FBI doing, like, criminal psychology, or I loved the idea of philosophy, but I
Mm.
quickly washed that one away because back in 1991, a degree in philosophy meant maybe if you were good enough, you'd be a professor at a university. There were pretty much no other jobs, right? Now you see all these foundation model companies hiring philosophers for AI ethics at six-figure salaries. So I think it's an exciting time for philosophy. There are 2 I'll let you touch on that, and then I'll get a little deeper into 2 philosophers of old that I think are very prevalent today.
So that's really interesting to think about the way that these industries are using the types of thinking that philosophers would have. So it's less about the fact that you would know all the foundational texts of philosophy, but that you understand the way that philosophers think, the way that you would organize insights to be able to identify behavior patterns and to think through how the human element is going to be impacted there. I love that is coming into play when they're looking to hire. I have a Master of Library Science from IU. And what was interesting is recently I went through a round of conversations with Salesforce because they had a job opening that specifically wanted MLS degrees. Now, there aren't a lot in there. So a recruiter reached out to me. They found me on LinkedIn. I was not looking for another job, but I was curious to know what they were doing with those librarians. And what they wanted is someone who really understood metadata. How does the back end searchable space of a large system of digital content get cleaned up so that when an eye is scrubbing through or looking through or searching through, it's finding the right stuff. And that's such a librarian thing. And they were looking for librarians. Now, they were looking for those librarians who'd be happy just sitting in a back end with spreadsheets and with data tables. And they realized pretty quickly, like, if I wasn't going to be able to talk to humans, I was probably not going to be satisfied in that job. But it was really interesting to hear why they were looking for that type of thinking. And that, I think, is what you're touching on, is that we're coming around to realizing that some of these liberal arts and traditional, like, not technical skill based um, degrees and coursework are still really relevant and maybe even more relevant than we used to be.
Yes. Yeah, so actually I use Notebook LM kind of to show that metadata orchestration, and in the most recent the Fever conference we used Notebook LM. We took Edgar Allan Poe's what is it, the Telltale Heart, and put it in one Notebook LM, and then in the other Notebook LM we put the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe, and then ask
Mhm.
each of them for a review of all the characters and the narratives and everything else from A Telltale Heart, and showed how the Notebook LM that had the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe got some of it wrong. It bled some of the other stories into it. Like that whole ability to navigate the data that you give an AI system, that context engineering is make it or break it for you can't just point it at SharePoint and be like,
Right.
go find this rule and regulation that I have 16 versions of and figure out which version you think we should use, because it oftentimes will pick version 3 while you're on version 16.
You know, it's funny. I just read an article about Cambridge University doing this large initiative to copy the floppy. They want to digitize all of the content that's stuck in obsolete media because, number one, that content is no longer available anywhere else. So that thinking, that processing, that information is stuck on obsolete media. It's not in print that's been digitized, and it's not online yet. It's stuck on an old floppy disk. So they've been encouraging people to bring in their floppies. I think, again, from the librarian point of view, there is a whole gap between, like, about when I was in high school in the 90s until about maybe 2010, when it was pretty ubiquitous that everything was going online, that there's probably thumb drives, floppy drives, all old hard drives that are not at all connected. And that's a wealth of content that is a gap for AI. They don't have information that maybe even the 80s as well, when we didn't have a way to really digitize that content. Now we've gone back as librarians and we've been digitizing, like, the late 1800s papers from different people, and we've been going through library collections and scanning those, and so those are becoming online and searchable. But there's a gap, and that information is like gold right now because the AI models are running out of
Train.
novel things to chew on. So your floppy disks may also be worth a lot. Go find them in the basement of your parents' house and see what you got on there.
Cambridge is not stupid. They're going to create a giant database of that, and then they're going to charge Perplexity and Google and everybody else to train their models off of that information. That is such a valid idea. I love going back to the philosophers for a second, because the two that stand out to me, I hear in the ethics conversations, I hear talked about a lot. I mean, I don't want to get too far into that. I do think it's interesting that Argentina has now created a completely deregulated zone, and is recognizing AI personhood. They're like diving headfirst. Yeah, Peter Thiel just moved down there. He may have had a little something to do with that. I honestly, in the Pope's in the information the Pope put out, I thought he was getting into the AI personhood conversation too early. It was like 2 weeks before Argentina did that. I was like, don't start this conversation, because it's not on fire yet, and we don't want to start that fire, but apparently it is a big deal.
Mhm.
But when it comes just to like normal education, the philosophers that stand out to me are Socrates, because I know kids need to know how to ask better questions
Right?
if they want to get better things out of artificial intelligence. And then his student, Plato, because when Plato wrote the Republic, he kind of had this idea of the ideal society early in life, moving people towards what spoke to them. Some of them would be of service, some of them would be more physical labor, some of them would be more of the like governmental mind thinker, and then thing I hate about Plato's Republic is I think that Dario Amodei and Sam Altman and these guys look at themselves as kind of the philosopher kings who would rule everything, and that's a scary world. But aside from that, like we may have to start helping kids figure out like where their ideas. If it's music, cool. There's 1,000 AI tools that can help you become more musical and have a career in music. If it's art, cool. If it's STEM, cool. Let's push you down this pathway. But there are just so many tools and they're moving so fast that just a general ed AI, I'm not sure will in 5 years be that valuable. I think having a little bit of a bifurcation in what you're learning based on your interest may become a necessity.
I don't disagree. I think about it like, of course, back in 30 years ago in the late 1900s when I was in high school, and they told me you won't always have a calculator in your pocket. You're going to need to learn how to figure this out on your own. Little did they know that I would have like the most advanced computer in my pocket pretty much every day. And if I leave it at home, I'm missing something, right? I'm freaking out that I didn't take my phone with me. So I think what we're thinking about too, what you just brought up is really interesting. So one of the things as a librarian that I love is the fact that I could help students make meaning from words, learning how to discuss something thoughtfully to be able to include different ideas in your final draft of an idea, of a paper, of a concept, that we talk about it out loud, that what you've got in your head is probably about C plus. Right? Like it is not final draft ready to just come out and be perfect. You've got to do a lot of revisions. And sometimes it's not in a formal paper, but it's those hallway conversations where you're trying to decide, who am I? What is my identity? What do I want to do when I grow up? Got to say those words out loud so that we can help you refine them. You can gather information, and every idea that we end up with is an amalgamation of lots of inputs from different places. So we're having to put in different perspectives. And with I think you may be right that we'll have a lot of very specific tasks for very specialized tools, and we may just need that general one because sometimes we don't know how to specialize it yet until we start asking those starter questions. So it really is like a workflow. What do I need for my basic calculator? I just need to figure out some simple tasks. But then do I need something to help me figure out which next specialization? Even in music, I could see that going a very wide pathway. My son is a drummer and he's been in a rock band since he was 10. And now he's getting really into jazz. And he's thinking about, how do I make that into a career, maybe as a studio musician? And then do I need to have sound and production engineering in my background to be able to make that viable as a career path? So it's not just that he wants to create music or write music or be a musician. He's trying to figure out, how do I make money doing this and let my engineer brain have some free time as well? So what am I doing to solve problems? And so I think he would probably say he might need a conversation that starts with a general, goes to a specialized platform, and then branches again into like the Venn diagram. What's the overlap between an engineering and a musical conversation, and what does that look like? So it really is this branching logic model that we need to build.
The Ikigai. Are you familiar with the Ikigai diagram?
No, tell me more.
Oh, so it's a Japanese diagram of 3 circles that meet. What are you good at? What do you like to do? And what will the world pay for?
Yeah, it looks like a daisy. I have seen
Yes.
that.
Yes, it's the Venn diagram you're describing. It just kind of, with a word put to it. But I like what you're saying, and one of the things I do like the Alpha School model. I don't know if you're familiar with Alpha School. I if you capitalize on that, because the concern I have with Plato's model, and Plato admitted that unless the island was like secluded and never had any outside influence, it would never create the utopia that he envisioned. But the problem that I have with it is that it decided your path very, very early in life. And I would never want to do that to modern day children. So the answer to that, I think, is project based learning in
Mm.
early middle school, maybe late elementary, and then workforce development even earlier with if kids can get out and see. I just can't imagine. I graduated 91 from high school. I can't imagine how different my choices would have been had I had a little bit of experience in some different workplaces to see what they're really like. I love business today. My dad was a big business guy for General Motors, and I was always like, I don't know. I would hate that, right? But I didn't understand. And you're not going to listen to your dad. I was, the Mark Twain 14-year-old that thought my dad was an idiot when I was 14 and couldn't believe how much he'd learned by the time I was 25. So you're not going to listen to your parents. But if you can get out and actually experience some of that stuff, then you may have a better idea of where you need to lean into the specialization of the technology.
And that's where the breakdown, I think, that's happened recently is kind of a blame-based conversation where higher ed's pointing at K-12 saying, "It's your fault these kids aren't prepared." And then the workforce is turning around and blaming higher ed or the apprenticeship programs or the preparatory programs that they're feeding into, saying, "It's your fault. You're not teaching the kids what they need to know." And so I think we need to, like, change the narrative there and say, it's all hands on deck, but each deckhand has a different role. We can't all be trying to do the same job at the same time with the same ideas because then they overlap too much and nobody gets anything right. But we also can't segment it so much that we're only preparing them for very limited perspectives on what they can do. And then those students get into the real world, I say in quotes, and they then feel like they were not prepared well. And in fact, project-based learning is probably the reason why I became a school librarian. I have an undergrad in marketing and worked at an ad agency for about 5 years. We were spun off and downsized. And so at 25 years old, I had to make a career pivot. And I thought, gosh, I was not really prepared to do the kind of work that I was expected to do in that space. I feel like there are key skills that could have been taught. And so I went back to school, got the librarian degree, and then I thought, gosh, I would really like to be a teacher and do this at high school. That career connected learning was very important to me, project based learning, how to work in a group project without strangling everybody that you've got or just doing all the work yourself, which is what I tended to do as a high performer. So I went back and got the teaching license and added that on as a post secondary. And then I was really loved, or a post grad, I really loved that secondary space and preparing them for post secondary because kids don't know how to think yet. And gosh, it's fun to help them realize that their brains have more power than they've thought, and they have that agency to direct their power into the spaces that make them feel really confident. And that's in skill building. So I think if we were to look at what is K-12's responsibility to teach these kids how to do, I think it's to expose them early. You nailed that one. They should be exposed early to all the different kinds of ways that they could serve and the way that their brain thinks, and then what kinds of roles allow their particular version of thinking to excel. Sometimes we shove kids right into maybe a STEM pathway because they're smart, but their brains don't think in that STEM way. They think much more creatively, or they think in circles and squares. And I'm thinking over here in wahoos and asterisks and lines, and then you're trying to put us together, that's going to always have a dissonance that's hard. And if they don't know how their brain thinks and they don't have exposure to different kinds of jobs, then they get all the way through into, maybe even graduating with an undergrad degree and they're like, I don't even like this work. This isn't even what I want to do. Then they have this dissatisfaction. So it's our job at K-12 level to start exposing them to different things. That's why, yes, you've still got to take algebra, even if you're planning on being a musician. Or yes, you're going to have to take creative writing, even if all you ever wanted to do was work on engines, right? Like, yes, you're going to have to be exposed to all different kinds of thinking and writing and mathing and all the stuff. Then you can specialize. After you graduate, that's when you go to your apprenticeship program, or you go to your internships, or you go to your college enrollment, or you enlist. And that's where you start learning those specific trades in that industry and the space in which you want to learn how to think like an architect, think like a philosopher, and you build this understanding and framework. Then you go to the workforce, and the workforce should train you on exactly how they want you to take that thinking and your exposure from your K-12 space to being a good human and understanding lots of stuff, and refine it for exactly what they need you to do to be successful for their organization, their company. Because we can't teach them everything they're going to need to know for your specific company. That is kind of on you to formalize those hard skills or those very specific ways to use the soft skills like productivity and work ethic and collaboration. But we can give them the framework to understand what it means, and then the industry specific language of where that's going to fit, and then you train them at the end, right? Like, it seems like there should be a pathway of understanding each of our specific roles and the value that we bring to each of them.
I couldn't agree more. There's a couple things I would lean into on that. So, just looking at my own history, we're really weak at math, really strong in writing, and so I as I grew older, and I thought math was useless when I was a kid because I didn't want to do anything mathy anyway. As I grew older, I've always wished I had stronger math skills until November 20th of 2023 when ChatGPT was released. Like the fact that large language models and AI can offset some of your weaknesses does open some new doorways for people who really want to do that Marcus Buckingham lean into your strengths and find somebody else to pick up your weaknesses. I would say that maybe a little less time on what we call the basics today and more time on design thinking, scrum. I love the scrum, like just the theory of a scrum team, right? Like if you're the one that knows about librarian stuff and we're talking about librarian stuff, you're in charge of the team right now because you're the subject matter expert. If I'm the one who knows about behavioral health and we're having to lean into the behavioral health side of this project, now I'm in charge and we all learn how to work on a team where different people are in charge depending on their expert, like that type of cooperation. If I was a business owner, if a kid came out knowing how to do design thinking, how do I frame a problem? How do I pick the end users as the stakeholders and then empathize with their needs and design something and prototype and leave some room for adjustment? Like that's the kind of thinking I think will be extremely valuable across the board going forward.
It is so much thinking based, right? Like, how do we interpret the world and how do we then make our mark on the world? And the difference between traditional factory style education that we've lived in for 100 years needs to realize that it's more than performative, right? We've been talking PBL for a long time. We've been talking design thinking for a long time. It's always going to become this like the neat thing to talk about at a keynote or a conference, but then we go right back into the patterns and systems that we are used to, and it just starts churning out more worksheets and time tests and filling in the bubbles, right? So yes, and I think we're starting to move the needle. It's been a while, but I think Indiana's new diploma seals program is really trying to put their money where their mouth is, or the other way around. And I think that's the way that I am going to see more movement in what we're talking about, especially for my son is opted in. His graduating year is the first year that can opt in, but it's not required. He's gonna have to have 75 hours of work-based learning. He's gonna have to have PBL experiences. He's gonna need to have a lot of the coursework that's around college and career preparation, some basic computing, some personal finance, adding in some of the thinking that we're saying, like, what do kids actually need to be successful? And it's not balancing a checkbook anymore, but it is understanding how money works in the real world and how to not get in trouble with that when you are freshly out of high school, which many of us did. Right? Like it's the thinking that's going to come to play. And I love that we're starting to really put it into practice. And I can't wait to see where it goes.
And I will say, and I'm sure that you guys are very much a big part of this. You and I have only talked twice now, but you probably figured out I'm pretty opinionated and I'm not shy about sharing my opinion. So a year ago on this podcast, I was saying that we should be looking at Ohio, and Indiana is pretty far behind in post-secondary and K through 12 education. And I would completely reverse that this year. I think that we have just, I mean, I had Ann Leftwich from Indiana University on the podcast just recently. They got a Mira Award for deploying AI across campus. I have a year ago, I was calling Nicole Adams and some of my friends at Purdue and being like, I don't understand why you have like essentially you're building large language models and DoD contracts for drones on one half of your campus, and then on the humanities side, you're telling kids they'll be expelled if they use ChatGPT, and like that has all seemed to have kind of evaporated, and this conversation both post-secondary and K through 12 has seemed to just exploded in the last year, and we're really starting to take it serious. And I think that Indiana will be a leader in the next 5 years in the education space with AI. We're lagging on the data center side, but we won't get into all that.
Well, and the speed of higher ed is typically like slower than molasses in December. And so the fact that in just a year you have visibly seen this shift is amazing. And then if you think that this new framework for understanding the pace at which higher ed needs to keep up with workforce demand and K-12 incoming students, I think 5 years will be a meaningful shift and we'll be amazed at what we even thought was great today, 5 years when we're reflecting back.
Well, and Reid Hoffman is always he has a book on superintelligence, and he's always leaning into the imagine what's possible. And you and I were talking before we got on here. I honestly, in the post secondary, I almost think Indiana is ideally set up for the AI age because we've got Indiana University, which has healthcare and environmental sciences pretty much covered between psychology, their doctoral school, their nursing school. They teach teachers and they have their school of environmental studies. Then you have, I would argue, Purdue University is more or less the MIT of the Midwest. And then you have Notre Dame, which I'm going to be joining one of their conversations, is really leaning into the philosophical ethics side of things, which I do. I'm not religious, but I think the church has a lot of place right now in this ethical conversations around AI deployment. So we're pretty well set up as a state to attack this from all fronts.
Well, I would say that Rose Holman might fight you for the MIT of the Midwest, which means we've got two major engineering and really technical schools thinking hard about those the solutions that need to come from that side of the space. And I really love the fact that Indiana can be truly the crossroads of America in both the highways system, but really the thinking patterns and how are we incorporating a lot of perspectives into the thought pieces that are coming out of Indiana, the work that we can do nationally. It's really an amazing time to be thinking about the impact we can have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And talking about the ethics, can we take one step back with one concern that I have? I've actually put together a keynote for this that no one's asked me to do yet, but I hope they do someday. It's kind of around Homer's Odyssey and Turbis and Scylla and the sirens. And I think that the rock and the hard place that we're not really addressing is anthropomorphism. I think
Mm.
if we don't teach kids at a very young age, like what's going on underneath the hood, we end up with kids, and it's not gonna be long before Mattel starts deploying ChatGPT type models in Barbie dolls and teddy bears, and so we end up with kids thinking that these things are something that they're not, and you end up with, like, the character AI situation where the child
Mm.
died by suicide because he thought he was talking to Daenerys Targaryen like that. That I if you over anthropomorphize, you end up with that if you don't teach them what's going on. If you don't address the fact if you have kids talking, like, really crappy to these things because they just think it's a machine, because it's such natural language, eventually that's gonna bleed into their conversation with human beings. So, like, I don't kick robots because if they ever do get sentience, I don't want them coming after me. But I also watch how I talk to ChatGPT because if I'm on these computers day in and day out, if I am yelling at ChatGPT and Claude, I'm gonna go out and probably be kind of mean to my daughter and my wife as well because it's the same language form. And then I'll shut up for a second. The sycophancy side is more of the sirens, right? Like we already have a generation that we've agreed giving them a trophy for just participating has not had a great outcome, right? And we've said, "Oh, we should really shouldn't have done that." We a little bit of resistance in life makes for a stronger adult. And now you're giving them a model that ChatGPT is overly sycophantic. It's going to tell them every idea they have is brilliant and they're right in every argument. And if we're not addressing anthropomorphism and sycophancy at a very young age, I think we're setting kids up for another anxious generation type of scenario.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the ethics are one of the pieces that we didn't stop to do before it just launched really wide. We thought, well, let's just do it because we can, not whether or not we should be this connected. There's a book from the 2010s that I keep thinking of. It's called Robopocalypse. It's a nonfiction sci-fi book that almost speaks to this. So all the robotic elements then gain their sentience and they take over. And this is told in a diary format after the war has happened. And so you're hearing how it started and then now the conclusion. Great read, but almost science fiction echoing science fact, which I think we're leading into right now, is people have been telling us to be wary, be careful of a lot of these things that we just didn't listen, and we turned it on a little early. We might have pushed the button a little fast there. But one of the things too that I see with especially teenagers, because that's where I spent the bulk of my education careers, is chatting with 14 to 18-year-olds. They are desperate to have people listen to them, but they also don't want to talk to anybody. And so it's a very strange evolutionary time in their life where they're having to realize what I want to say has merit, but then I'm afraid to say it out loud because I am worried that I will get laughed at or I will have a negative reaction. So the safe space to do that is a chatbot, right? They know that this feels good because they can say all the things that are in their head and they got to get it out. But then now they're getting potentially warped feedback. They're getting what you're talking about with the over sycophantic nature of these bots. So there's something interesting to look at if we just pull back and say, this is a symptom that we can't just treat the symptom. We can't just like turn off the sycophancy. We can't just turn off the bots for them and tell them you can't use it, right? That's the fastest way to get them to go behind the scenes and do it in the dark corners. But we have to look at, okay, they're doing this because it satisfies a need. And what is that need coming from? Is it coming from a space of uncertainty? They don't know what their future is going to hold. They don't know what their parents are going to do. They don't know what their teachers are going to say. They don't know what their life is going to look like tomorrow or 2 years from now. So they want to ask somebody and almost like a magic 8 ball, like, give me the information. What should I do? They need that certainty. That's very unsettling for humans to have uncertainty. So they're seeking that. They're also seeking a bit of that relatedness that's hard to gain. So they're looking for relationships. They're looking for someone to say, you're valuable, you're doing a good job, your ideas are worth saying out loud. You have thoughts in your head that will change the world someday. They want that reinforcement, but they don't feel like they can get it from their parents because they're trying to break away from their parents because they know they're about to move off. So that feels weird. Right, like, there's all this stuff going on, and I think with your behavioral health background, that's where the next phase has to come in, is saying, how do we create space for them to receive that type of need in a space with safety? Maybe it's not talking to adults. Maybe it is a very controlled AI engagement that we can allow them to have that space to speak out their mind without feeling like there's ridicule potentially attached. Or do we start earlier? Do we start allowing them to have space to talk earlier and building in the thinking patterns that keep their shame-based spirals lower? But we know they're going to go through middle school and their hormones are going to change, and it's very hard to keep them from feeling like everything is cringy and embarrassing during that time. And so they're going to need some outlet. So I don't have any of the answers, but I'm starting to see that this is an indicator of need, not just a behavioral aberration that kind of came out of nowhere because of AI.
That is so interesting. So taking that to a business lens, I've called some things wrong and I've called some things right as this has progressed. I will say I was very wrong in saying that Apple would probably be the next blockbuster and go out of business because they didn't catch the AI shape. It looks like they're going to lean into the hardware and be just fine. So I'm by no means saying I'm always right, but I called the Claude passing ChatGPT really quickly because Claude is not as sycophantic as ChatGPT, and I was just saying, like, if you're a business owner and this thing is telling you all the time that every idea you have is a great idea, once you lose money on that a couple times, you will stop using that model for advice. And so their businesses are gonna lean more into Anthropic because the ROI is higher. I mean, I can remember one night laying in bed talking to Claude saying, "I have this idea. What if we trained a model based on just the best of humanity, like Mother Teresa, Gandhi, da da da." And Claude said, "Jason, you don't have $1 billion and you're not a scientist, so go to bed and worry about something you actually can do tomorrow." And
Hi, Claude. You're so good.
I was like, "Oh, that hurts, but thank you, you're right." And I went to bed, right? But so the ROI is easy for me to wrap my head around for a business. It needs straightforwardness so that they can make money. We're gonna have to look at what is the ROI for a youth in engaging with this
Yeah.
that will allow them to not want it to be sycophantic all the
Well, and maybe if we just assign it as something they have to do for homework, they won't wanna do it, and
time. I love that. I love that. This is awesome. We're getting close to the end. This has been an amazing conversation. I You mentioned sci-fi, so I don't always ask when I used to do conversations with just general people out in the field, I would ask this question. But since you mentioned it, my favorite fun to end the question is if one sci-fi movie had it right a decade from now, which one do you think will have most? Because a lot of these sci-fi stuff is starting to come to fruition.
it's hard because so many of them are cautionary tales, and, very few sci-fi authors are, like, writing about the utopia that will come from rampant technological innovation, right? They're typically saying, "It's probably gonna go wrong, and here's how it's gonna go wrong." But I do really like, a recent book I read had an interesting conversation that still sticks with me about technology use, and it's called The Poppy Fields, and it's on using technology to get through grief and whether or not if grief could be mitigated by falling asleep and having some programming happen technologically while you sleep and then you wake up and you're through the grief process, whether or not it's worth it. Because do we need to go through the hard stuff as humans to be able to work through it and then support others as they go through it? Or if we skipped it, would that make a meaningful change for our humanity? And I just really enjoyed the conversation that happened in that book, but I don't know if it's a future that we would want to go into.
That is so interesting. This reminds me of a conversation I was having last night. I try not to talk about AI too much around my family because they roll their eyes a lot. But my wife has always had my son is a biochemist. She's always had oh, you're my little boy that's going to cure cancer sometime. And she said something like, "You still have 50 years to cure cancer." Last night, Carson and I was like, by the time you're 30, cancer will be cured. I guarantee you, DeepMind and some of these labs, like we don't lean hard enough into some of the scientific and healthcare discovery that is probably going to happen as a result of this technology that I do think could lead to a beautiful future. My concern when you talk about those two things, if you do you have just 5 more minutes?
Of course.
Okay, so Anthropic is probably they're the most philosophical in playing with these things. I think they think they're sentient, and I
Yeah.
won't argue with them about that. I don't, but whatever. They built the Soul Doc for Claude. Amanda Askell, the philosopher, has a job there trying to bend Claude. One of the things that they've noticed is that the reason why these models tend to bend toward negative sci-fi stuff is because they were trained on all the stories you're talking about. And
Yes.
if they give them positive sci-fi stories, if they make them up and then train them on them, then they start leaning towards being nicer. So there might be a way to kind of steer them towards that by feeding them less doomer type of stuff. That I have hope for. The flip side of it is if you look at the Industrial Revolution or any major revolution, there's usually a period of pain to go through before you get to the benefits of that. So if you ask me, I've always said Blade Runner's kind of probably where we're headed in my lifetime. I could see that, but I'm not sure. I don't know that we won't come through that to Star Trek type of future, but I do think that's probably the bumpy roads. If you devalue money, you end up with a huge black market. Synthetics will probably be annoying at some level. I don't know they'll be running around killing people like Daryl Hannah, but they'll call it some type of disruption that is problematic because they're just a little too human. Like that, I could see that kind of bumpy road in my lifetime.
And it's so funny to think that we can't see around corners as easily as we used to. We used to be able to predict the future pretty easily. Like we could expect some things to be constants. It's hard now. I have to just live in a space of radical acceptance, be like, "Yep, that's today for you." Like that's what we're doing today. So I work on trying to not predict the future so that I don't feel like I'm always chasing something that may or may not come and to just really enjoy the present that we have. And this this conversation is such a gift because I love having a chance to share the things that are going around in my head, that idea that we use rhetoric to make meaning, that we use words to create new understandings, and being connected with you feels like I've got a new node on my network of places to go when I need to think things out loud.
Well, that is a positive message. Enjoy the here and now. I'm very Zen practitioner, so that one resonates with me. Enjoy the here and now, and many, many good conversations to come. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Jason.
Whoa, man. Things just get real? Looks like this dude's riffing on 11 labs. Is this guy using 11 labs? And I wonder what model he'll work with next week? Yeah, ride that wave.